Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Old Testament manuscripts in our continuing study of biblical languages. First, we need to speak about the Masorites. The name Masorah is the Hebrew word for tradition, and this was a Jewish community originally based in the area of Tiberias. Tiberias was one of the Roman cities on the southwest side of the And it was these folks who gave us the vowel points. If you look at the two, one line, but I separated in two sections. Notice on the right we see Adonai Elohim, but notice it's the little dots and dashes, that system of vowel points that are under the letters, as opposed to on the right you see exactly the same term Adonai Elohim, but the vowel points aren't there. So I think it's a little bit like when perhaps you were first learning to read and write in English or whatever your native language is. They might have used those little markers over and under the vowels to say if it's a long vowel or a short vowel. You don't need that anymore now that you're an adult and you can read, but you needed that back then to help you. Um, Same thing today. When you pick up a Jewish newspaper, it's going to have the Hebrew. There won't be any vowel points because adults don't need that. People like myself that aren't all that good in Hebrew do need them, and so we make full use. I confess that includes myself. But if you ever look at a Bible that doesn't have the vowel points, you'll be able to make it out. It's not going to be quite so easy. You need the help, and I use all the help I can get, but it's still readable. And the original text didn't have those. Now, there were careful rules that the Masoretes sort of brought about in the copying of the scriptures. They wanted to be very, very careful. Where if you made a mistake, you weren't supposed to just scratch it out. Don't know if they always kept the rules, but you were supposed to start over again. And then certain rituals you would go through. For example, when you were about to write the name of the Lord, and certain things like that, they would count how many words were on each line, and then how many lines per page, and very, very careful. Now, it was quite a bit different when you get to the New Testament copyists. Sometimes you had, with the New Testament, you had professional scribes, and then sometimes you had, frankly, I don't mean it in a mean way, but rank amateurs who would make amateur mistakes. And that's okay. They were doing their best. But the Masoretes were very, very careful and had a professional-like quality about copying the scriptures. Now, one of our earliest complete copies of the Hebrew Bible is the Leningrad Codex. It dates to 1010 AD. We can be quite exact because it actually there's a notation within it that says when it was copied. It's our oldest complete Hebrew Tanakh. When I say Tanakh, of course, I'm speaking of the entire Hebrew Bible, the Torah, that is the law, the Naviim, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which is the word for the writings. So that's their division. We say Pentateuch and historical books and poetical books and prophets. They would say the law, the prophets, and the writings. And so those terms are used to spell that word Tanakh. It's sort of an anagram, I guess. It was composed in Cairo, and it's located today in the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg. It's currently published as the Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartensia. Excuse my German, but you can purchase a copy. It's not all that cheap, but you can purchase one at my office at the college. I've got one sitting on the desk. Here's a page from that Leningrad Codex. You can see it's very precise. Notice the straight lines. This is before the printing press, so this is all done by hand. And it's got notations, telling you, about, I'm not even sure what those notations are, so I don't want to say. But notice you've got the vowel points. They are there in the text. Now, you had this Masoretic family of texts that have been passed down. This is our oldest complete copy. You also have, we're going to talk a bit later about the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found at a place called Qumran. So when I say Qumran, I'm referencing the Dead Sea Scrolls. You also have the Septuagint. That's the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. Now, because it's a translation, it's not going to be exact. When you move from one language to another, you're never exact. But still, it's helpful, especially with larger sections and giving a different voice. And then you also have what's known as the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now, the Samaritan Pentateuch, in one place at least, is very different from the Hebrew text. And instead of 10 commandments, they have 11 commandments. And the 11th commandment was, "You shall worship the Lord here on Mount Gerizim," which I think is an obvious addition. But in other ways, it might actually be quite accurate. And so we should listen to it, maybe not about that 11th commandment, but about all sorts of other areas. Now, some theories have been put about. I'm borrowing here from Paul Wegner's, wrote an article for the Bulletin for Biblical Research, and he cites some of the different theories of Hebrew development, of how the Hebrew text came about. Uh, Lagarde's theory was that the Masoretic text began as one original copy, and that all Old Testament manuscripts were derived from that text. Um, so, the Masoretic text all comes from one original source. It's an interesting theory, but not everybody holds to that. Kale from Oxford suggests that instead, many divergent manuscripts eventually into standardized into one official text. That is, you had a number of different Hebrew texts, and some, as we said before when we were talking about textual criticism, anytime you're copying, there's a possibility of a strong possibility, probability, that somewhere along the line there's going to be an error that creeps into the text, not intentionally, but people make mistakes, and so that what we have in this Masoretic text, dating back to the Leningrad Codex, is that eventually it came about not from one original source, but it was sort of collated, and they said, well, this reading must be the correct one versus that one, and that it came down into one official text. Albright, as well as Frank Cross, a well-known Harvard professor, uh, held that the original text was copied and maintained in three different areas, giving rise to three different families of texts. And so notice they refer to the Palestine text, um, and notice that's both the Septuagint and the Chronicles Masoretic text, and some that are found in Qumran. Then also the second family would be the Babylonian text. That would be the Masoretic text, although not from Chronicles. And also notice Qumran gives evidence to both of these families. In fact, when you look at the first two scrolls of Isaiah that were found when I say the first two, the original Dead Sea Scroll finds was 7 scrolls. 2 of those scrolls were copies of Isaiah, and they're not identical. I mean, they're close. They're both the book of Isaiah, but there's a few places where they differ from one another. One of them seems to have been modernized a little bit. And so this is, Albright and Cross especially, looking back at the Dead Sea Scrolls, is coming to this conclusion. And then Egypt, with its Septuagint, is the third family. And notice they're not just speaking about the Greek Septuagint, but the fact that would seem to be supported by a different family of Hebrew texts. Another theory, this one coming from Talmud, is that the Hebrew text existed in a variety of forms, some of which are lost to us today. And if it's lost, then it's hard to speculate what that might have been. But and again, he's noting that 3 textual families survived because they were protected by certain religious groups. The Christians held to the Septuagint, and that there's a lot of truth to that, even though it had been put together before the Christian era. Later on, as Christians came along, and especially as more and more Christians were Greek speakers instead of being Jewish, they gravitated to the Septuagint as their text. And then also the Samaritans, notice that's the SP, um, and Judaism as well. And so notice that third and fourth are not all that different from each other. Finally, you have Emmanuel Tov of the Hebrew University, and he suggests that the various manuscripts are related in a very intricate web of agreements. In other words, it's not as simple as just three families, but it's much more convoluted than that. Exclusive readings, and that Qumran testifies not to three, but to five groups of manuscripts, so that you had those who were followers of the Qumran practices. We usually think that they were the Essenes, although they didn't call themselves that. The Proto-Masoretic manuscripts, manuscripts that eventually led to because this is long before the Masorites came along. Pre-Samaritan manuscripts, because this is also before what we think of as the Samaritan Pentateuch comes along. And then notice the Septuagint manuscripts, just a few of those, that manuscripts that more point to a Septuagint reading, even though they're not in Greek, they're in Hebrew. Just 5%. And then some that just don't seem to fit any. Notice 35%, that's quite a large group that don't seem to fit any, which is why he goes to an intricate web. It's much more than just those three families of texts. Now, what we have then is the original text, and as it's copied, two different things happen. First of all, there's those that are just carefully copying the text. I'm not saying they never make any errors, but that's what they're about. If it says it here, they're copying it as they're finding it. And then there are some, like I mentioned about the two Isaiah manuscripts, where one of them it looks like it's very carefully being copied, and the other one shows signs in a couple of places. It's not all through the text, but every once in a while there'll be an update to the text where, for example, a word has fallen out of use. They'll substitute it with this is the word we use nowadays, or they'll clarify something, make it a slight change to make it more readable and understandable. And so in that case, they're not trying to change the text, but they're trying to update it. We don't use that word anymore. Nobody knows what it means. We do the same thing with translations today. If you go and read, get a copy of the King James Version, what you're reading in the King James Version is not the way they translated it back in 1611. Because the English language you say, well, it looks very old. It does look old, but it was updated in the 1700s as the English language had made some very big changes just in that 100 years. And so it needed to be updated. The way they spelled certain words got changed, and certain words themselves were changed. And so what you're reading when you read the King James is not the original 1611 version. You're reading an update. And the same thing happened with the Hebrew text in certain cases. Now, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, notice, which reflects both of those. Even in that first find of the two Isaiah scrolls, you have one that's very careful copying of the text, unchanged, and another that shows those occasional updates. And the Masoretic text, that follows the tradition of carefully copying the text, which is why we generally use that text. Most people will use a Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartia, that Hebrew text, and that's what we'll generally use. Every major English translation relies on that Masoretic text to at least a certain degree. However, sometimes you'll see on the side there'll be footnotes that note the resignification, that note an alternate reading. And sometimes because it's just been updated, or sometimes there's actually a difference. And so you look at things like the Aramaic Targums. These are additional I would think of them as almost like commentaries. The Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, that sometimes will contain a different reading, or not necessarily from either of those groups, just the Dead Sea Scrolls will occasionally have a different reading of the Hebrew text. And we looked at this in our earlier lecture on textual criticism. Now, one of the sources, we already mentioned the Masoretic text, that's the source that came down to us, but another source is known as the Cairo Genizah. Cairo, of course, is the city in Egypt, it's the capital of Egypt. And a Genizah is a storeroom. You can think of it as sort of a basement or an attic, although it's not over or under necessarily, but it's a storeroom of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo. And what happens is when they have a a copy of their scriptures. And remember, these are all hand copied. And they have a copy of the scriptures, and it's been used in the synagogue. But then time passes, and it gets older and older and older, and the ink starts to fade, and perhaps the leather on the manuscript, because that's a parchment, it begins to get a little brittle. And what do they do with one when it's getting to the point of not quite, it's almost becoming to be unreadable and it's falling apart? You don't want to have your Bible falling apart in this. Remember, this is a manuscript. This is a scroll that you would use for worship. Well, you've already used it to make copies of other scrolls, but what do you do in a reverent manner with such a scroll? You don't just throw it away. That would be considered very disrespectful. You don't burn it. I suppose you could bury it, but what they do is they put it in the storeroom. It's sort of, think of it as a mausoleum for scrolls, a place of burial for scrolls. Now, back in the late 1800s, 1896, there were these two sisters. They were known as the Westminster Sisters. I don't remember their first names. Uh, and they were very scholarly. They had received degrees from um, uh, universities in England, and they had traveled to Cairo. And they got to visit the Genizah. I'm not sure how that worked out, but they were allowed to bring some fragments, some of these very old, scrolls that had been reverently put aside. They were allowed to bring some of these back to England. And there they showed them to Rabbi Solomon Schechter. And he looked over these, and he noted their great age and their antiquity. And they convinced him of the value of this. They returned with him to Cairo for further study, because as they would examine these very, very old scrolls and compare them to what was being used in their day, again, there would be one of those, some very subtle differences. It was still the same. Isaiah was still Isaiah, hadn't changed, but a word here or a word there might actually be different. And so they returned, and the good rabbi was allowed to go through, and you see a picture of him sitting at his desk, notice, with just scraps, pieces of scrolls. These documents were moved to various museums, and about 300,000 manuscripts. Now, they weren't all full manuscripts. Sometimes they were just in pieces and tatters, because they had been well used and then reverently put aside, and then age had taken its toll. So about 300,000 manuscripts, and 870 of them, no, notice, excuse me, the dates ranged from 870 AD to the 19th century. So some of these actually were older than the Leningrad Codex. And included in this find was a Hebrew version of the book of Ecclesiasticus. Now, that's not the same as Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a book in the Old Testament. Ecclesiasticus is a book from the Apocrypha, and part of that, we only had that in Greek. So apparently, was this a Hebrew translation, or was it originally written in Hebrew and then later had been translated into Greek? But they found a Hebrew version and several fragments of what came to be known eventually as the Damascus document. Now, Damascus document is going to be something that's in the original finds of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But when it was found there, it had already been found in the Cairo Genizah. So notice, we're going to find this writing, this sort of document that talks about the temple and talks about worship, and it's found in both places. Also was found an Augustan palimpsest, that is uh, a portion of writing that had contained some things by Augustine, some writings of, but then the writing had been scraped off and the scroll had been reused for other purposes, sort of recycled documents. And when that takes place, they can actually go back and find the original writing. And we talked in another class about the Ephraimi Rescriptus, this scroll of the New Testament, where the New Testament had actually been scraped off, so to make way for some sermons by somebody else. So this sort of thing was found here as well. Now let's look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the date goes back to 1947. Now I'm putting in Palestine here, not because I'm disrespecting Israel, but there was no nation of Israel yet. It wouldn't be until spring of 1948 that Israel would become a nation again. So at this point, it was still called Palestine. And by the shores of the Dead Sea was where this find was located, a little place that is known in Arabic as Qumran. And so we refer to it as the Qumran ruins. And near there were some caves. So the date was 1947. And here at Qumran by the northeastern, excuse me, the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, was where these scrolls were originally located. Later on, both treasure hunters but also archaeologists went through all the caves in the area and found in a number of more caves a great many more scrolls. Here's a look at that cave. You're actually seeing cave number 4 there in the distance, and then up on that escarpment off to the right would be the ruins of the Qumran community. But then all throughout the mountains in the background, you can find caves dotted through it there, and over about a mile area are the different places where they found copies of scriptures. Now the languages that were represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of them were Hebrew. There were a few Aramaic, which is a lot like Hebrew, but it's still a separate language. And recently I was reading through Daniel chapter 2, which Daniel actually switches to Aramaic in chapter 2 and verse 4. And there's some words that, if you can read Hebrew, are easily recognizable, and then some words that where it changes quite a bit. So it is a separate language. And there's even fewer in Greek. Now, the writing materials that are used, most of them are parchment. That's animal skin. I think calf was the most common and the most desirable. I'm given to understand that they actually found one manuscript in camel skin. It's probably sort of rough, and that was not optimum. There were a few papyri and one copper scroll, not a biblical text. That was actually almost like a treasure hunter's guide. We're not sure what to make of that. The subject matter, there were biblical texts, what we think of as the Old Testament. There were also other Jewish writings, so it wasn't limited just to the Bible. And there were some books that were of a very unique Jewish sect. We think of those as the Essenes, and some of their writings that were exclusive to them were found as well. The total number of documents, 930, and they date to between 250 BC all the way to 50 AD. Most of them aren't quite that old. Most of them are between 150 to 50 BC. So not all that many that date after the or in not after, but into the New Testament era. No copies of the New Testament. Let me just say that for the record. There's no references to anybody mentioned in the New Testament, but of course, there's copies of Old Testament scriptures, and most of them between that period of 150 to 50 BC. Now, with respect to biblical texts, here are the numbers. In 15 copies of Genesis. When I say that, that doesn't mean entire copies of the whole book of Genesis. That means scraps and pieces, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, that all reflect the book of Genesis, 18 for Exodus, and so on. Notice that Deuteronomy, quite a number of copies of Deuteronomy, 31 manuscripts or portions of manuscripts, Isaiah 22, and Psalms 39. So the most represented books were Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and Psalms. More copies of those books than from all the others. Notice from the minor prophets, and when I say minor prophets, there's 12 different books of the minor prophets, and only 10 pieces or portions of pieces from the minor prophets which means that not every book in the Minor Prophets was represented. Likewise, no copies of the Book of Esther. Well, that's, there was only one copy of Ezra and Nehemiah, only one copy from First and Second Chronicles. So there were some books that were, we would say, underrepresented. Just because Esther wasn't found, there were some other books that were almost not found. That doesn't mean too much, and don't take that against Esther, except that a number of those books, very few copies or even portions of copies were found. Here's a section from Isaiah chapter 53. Now, what I've done here, I've put like a blow up, sort of photographed it and blew it up here, the Dead Sea Scroll, and then right under it is the Masoretic text. So notice it's very, very close. And I'm going to read a translation here. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. There's a messianic passage from Isaiah 53. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. That's right from I'm quoting here from the New American Standard. But notice that in verse 11, there's an addition where the Dead Sea Scroll says, after he has suffered, he will see the light of life. You see that term, or. That's actually, that single word is not in the Masoretic text. It's an alternate reading. Changes the reading slightly. You will see that, you say, well, was that, which one's original? Which one's correct? My answer is, I don't know, but I think it's probably more likely that something was omitted by error than that something was added either intentionally or by error. Now, I don't know that for sure. Oftentimes there are textual critics that like to say, well, the shorter reading is to be preferred. Maybe. I don't really, or could it be the shorter? Could it be the longer? I don't know. But it's interesting that the older texts, and of course the Dead Sea Scrolls are more than 1,000 years older than our older previous Hebrew text, which was the Leningrad Codex, and the older text reflects the longer reading in this case. Now, textual issues, and let me explain when I notice this 4Q Exod, which is short for Exodus A. Let's explain that. First of all, the 4 means that this was found in Cave 4. And then Q stands for Qumran. So this is Cave 4 at Qumran. Here's a portion of the book of Exodus. And because a number of copies of Exodus were found, this is Exodus A. And so this is a text. And when you read it in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 5, the text reads that there were 75 people who came out of Canaan and into Egypt, which the Septuagint also reads, in contrast to the Masoretic text that says there were 70. It leaves out the number 5. And so notice I have two different readings. Now, if you had been reading just the Septuagint, you might have thought, well, the Septuagint got it wrong. It's just a poor translation. They forgot to translate, or not forgot, they actually added the number 5 somehow in there. But this tells us that the Septuagint reading was following a Hebrew reading that is evidenced in 4Q Exodus A. That's evidenced in this Hebrew manuscript. And that's an interesting testimony to the value of the Septuagint. A second issue. This is, notice, 4Q Deuteronomy J. So it's, again, the 4th cave of Qumran, that one that's actually right next to the Qumran community. It's an artificially dug cave. And J, there's been a bunch of copies of Deuteronomy. We noted that already. And it reads Beniel, that just means sons of God, in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8, in contrast to the Masoretic texts, which reads children of Israel. Notice sons of God instead of children of Israel. Which is it? I'm not going to argue. I'm just going to note that there's two different readings. It doesn't really change anything. It's still, the people, the context really speaks of who they are, but it is a different term that's used. 4Q Samuel A. This is book of one of the books of Samuel. In this case, it's First Samuel. They didn't divide it necessarily up into 2 books. We do that, and it adds several verses before reading before reaching 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. 1 Samuel 11:1, that's the story of how the king of Ammon had come and invaded some Israelite territories in the eastern side of the Jordan River, including the city of Jabesh Gilead. And the story picks up there in our version, in the Masoretic text, in your Bible. But it adds a couple of verses saying about how he captured some other cities leading up to that, and just giving a little bit of historical background. It doesn't change the overall story. It just gives a little bit of the background leading up to that. And notice that background is found in this Hebrew text. Between Psalm 145, verses 13 and 14, and that's an acrostic psalm, um, where the first verse starts with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and then the next letter starts with the next verse starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And as it gets down to verse 13, you get to verse 14, it skipped a letter. And it adds this. Notice, and I'm just going to read the translation. God is faithful, but it's by the time you get down there, it's to the letter Nun. That's how that verse starts, and it translates, God is faithful in His words and loving kind, uh, or I'd say loyal. That's probably a better translation. It's that old friend Chesed, but He's loving kind or loyal in all His deeds. And so notice there's an extra verse. Now that same verse is echoed. It's almost exactly. It's a little bit different, but very close in verse 17. Um, and although it puts in a different starts off with a different Hebrew letter, so that it still maintains its place in the acrostic. Um, Now, was this something that was added, or was this original? I don't want to say because I don't know. But it completes the acrostic and doesn't change the psalm because the same essential thing is said later on in the same psalm. Is it being repeated, or was that an insertion where they wanted to make? I don't know. Um, I'm not going to make a judgment call on this. There's a difference in 1Q Isaiah. This is one of the Isaiah scrolls found in that first cave. In Isaiah chapter 7:14, this is the passage that talks about how a virgin will conceive. Here's the passage. Therefore, the Lord, notice Adonai. That's not. I didn't put it in all caps. That's not the name of God. That's just the word Lord. Therefore, the Lord Himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and will bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. And that's how you read it in the Masoretic text. When you look at it in 1Q Isaiah A, that Isaiah scroll, notice for the Lord, it instead of having the word Adonai, it's actually the word Yahweh. Now usually I pronounce that Adonai, but I'm not going to do it here because it's actually two different ways that it's written. Therefore, Yahweh Himself, now it's still talking about the Lord, it hasn't changed anything there, will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son. Notice another change in the Masoretic text. It says, and she will call his name Emmanuel. In this case, it says, and he will call his name Emmanuel. So actually, the um, the pronoun, and what is it? It's a pronoun suffix in Hebrew, where it's at the end of the word that's just attached to the one who's doing the calling. It's feminine in the Masoretic text. It's masculine instead of feminine. So instead of she, it's he will call his name Emmanuel. His name's still called Emmanuel. The substance of the verse hasn't changed, but this is a real difference. Here's one final one. In 4Q Samuel, that is Cave 4. They only found one copy of Samuel there, so we don't need another designation behind that. And in describing Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4, instead of being 6 cubits in a span, which would put him like 10 feet tall, a cubit being roughly around 18 inches, it describes him as being 4 cubits in a span. That's like 6 feet, 8 inches, something like that. The height of a rather tall basketball player. A giant to people living back then, because a lot of people were considerably shorter back then. But still, not. Now, which one's correct? Again, I'm not going to take sides here. I'm just reporting that you have a textual difference between the Hebrew text of one place and the Hebrew text in another place. It's not a translational issue, it is a textual difference. Our conclusion, then, is that the differences that exist bear testimony that the Masorites, that they knew about some of these. Sometimes you can look at Chronicles, and then you'll see over in Kings where there'll be a slightly different reading, maybe a name is spelled differently or something like that, or where a king is said to be 17 or 18 years old at his ascension, and then over in Kings it might say that he was 8 years old, and there's evidently a difference. And the Masorites knew about those differences, and they resolved, we're not going to try to correct the text. We're going to leave it exactly as is. We know that one of these readings is wrong, but we don't know which one, so we're going to leave it. And so the differences that exist bear testimony that the Masorites were determined not to change the text, even if they knew that one reading was an error. But they said, that's the way it was passed down to us. We're going to be faithful to that reading. And that's a good thing. That's telling us how careful they were to preserve the text. And that means you can trust their effort, that they took great care in the preservation of the Hebrew text.